grandfather and my uncle were both diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. My grandfather looked after himself rigorously and managed to survive the illness to a late age. My uncle was an artist. He had seen the life of restrictions endured by my grandfather and decided he didn't like the idea that the illness would take over his life. He decided not to look after himself. He lived freely, passionately, but died 2 years later. When I was born, my family insisted I was just like my late uncle. I had his rebellious spirit, his artistic skills, and most probably because I was constantly compared to a dead person. I knew that life is short, and every year that passed was 1 year less that we had to live. Here, I'm already depressed at my 4th birthday. As a child, I found refuge in looking again at everything as if it was my last day, and trying to imagine how things could be different. My father, an art teacher, encouraged me to make the things that I saw. So I started with simple things. For example, I reimagined a cup of tea to capture the act of sharing. Or I discovered I could make small changes that could make a big difference, like 3 little cuts on the ends of sushi sticks so they could now be turned into forks, or could be split to become chopsticks, having both Oriental and Occidental together on a single strip of wood. I also realized that I could recycle what others discarded, like the leather from punctured soccer balls, and utilize that to make new, more resistant soccer shoes. So, while looking again at everything, I noticed that we're taught by society to solve problems by zooming in and focusing on them, which makes complete sense. Nevertheless, if everyone is zooming in on a problem, everyone's solutions tend to be the same, because we're all approaching a problem from the same perspective. If instead I took one step back, I could stop focusing on the problem and instead start seeing those who were trying to solve it and how they were trying to solve it. From my distance, I could see other options that they couldn't. For example, if I looked at the way we've been making dresses, I could see that a zipper is used to bond 2 pieces of cloth. If I threw away the cloth and just bonded 100 zippers together, I could have a flexible dress that could be shortened to a mini skirt, extended to a formal party dress or a t-shirt or whatever. In the same way, I looked at how we make shelves and noticed that most shelves are these long, fixed planks. I could instead change those for hundreds of small pivoting ones that could go down or up depending on when we needed them, creating a flexible wall. And looking again at furniture, I stepped back to see how cabinets are made and noticed that the drawers slide on the rails. I discarded the idea of a cabinet and made my own entirely out of rails so it could now explode open beautifully. So taking 1 step back, I was able to see how things were fabricated. Taking 2 steps back, I was able to see what was the logic that dictated how we solved things. For example, why was the logic that dictated that we had to cut down trees and slice them into boards to make wooden tables? Why couldn't I instead topple a tree over, throw a glass on top, and accept that nature's shapes would be much more beautiful than anything I could come up with anyway? In the same way, all sorts of non-traditional materials started appearing as an option. Of all those, why should taxidermy be out of bounds? So taking 1 step back allowed me to see how others solve a problem. Taking 2 steps back allowed me to see what was the logic that dictated how others solve problems. Naturally now taking 3 steps back, I could remember why we were trying to solve the problem in the first place. Take my university thesis, for example. Why was I asked to write 200 pages that no other student would ever read? Instead, I tried to convince the school that if they allowed me to include in the library the first and only blank thesis, the mere story of a blank thesis would spread like an urban legend amongst the students and ignite in them the spirit of invention and rebellion. The director of the school told me the reason why I had to write 200 pages was because I'd be kicked out otherwise. Even though my thesis was rejected, I was convinced an idea didn't have to be material, that we could sell and buy an idea. So what I did was I packaged, exhibited, and sold nothing at all. Nothing was inside this beautiful packaging. Nothing would sell for $5. Signed nothings would sell for $20. Nothing was a success. I sold 1,000 nothings and ended up buying my first car with nothing at all. Today, nothing is collectible and nothing is quite expensive. So looking again at everything became my passion and my method of work as both an artist and a designer. But for someone who is obsessed with mortality, I felt that I needed to work with big corporations so I could try and come up with solutions that could help millions of people. Fortunately, and thanks to the press generated by nothing at all, I started getting calls from companies that were curious to see what I could come up for them. A tile company called me up and said, "Sebastian, we want you to design some outdoor tiles." I looked at tiles and saw that they're basically flat bricks with an oven-glazed varnish on top. I told the company to put a stencil over the tiles before they were varnished. This way, we would have a normal-looking tile, but when it rained, the area that was non-varnished would suck up the water, become darker, and now the words "caution, slippery when wet" would appear. A dishware company invited me to design some new plates. I stepped back to see the way we've always eaten with soup. And I created a soup bowl that had one end deeper than the other, like a swimming pool. So now, as we ate soup, it would naturally go down towards us and avoid us having to annoyingly tilt our plates to get those final spoonfuls, as we've done for centuries. A wine company called me up and asked me to design their new label. I stepped back and I saw their designers creating the most beautiful labels within the designated square. I stepped back again, and now I saw their beautiful labels lost amongst hundreds of others on the supermarket aisle. I told the company to remove the label off the bottles. Now, their bottle of wine would stand out amongst hundreds. And when the curious customer picked it up, they would find at the bottom the new label hidden and want to share that discovery with their friends. One day, I even got called to become a personal advisor for the future president of my country. I walked into a room, giant room, filled with senators, and was introduced as a new creative promise. The president, without even lifting an eye, said, "That will have to be seen, Mr. Errazuriz." I nervously got up, reached into my suitcase and said, "Mr. President, last year I sold 1,000 nothings for $5 each. I'm sure I'll be able to do something for your campaign." I quickly realized that the president was having trouble with the lower income vote. I also stepped back to notice that it didn't make sense for us to hire thousands of people to give out leaflets. I noticed that the lower income vote was traveling on a 70% basis on buses every day to work. I also saw that those buses were in the hands of free businessmen. I told the president we needed to pay those free guys to allow us to reprint all the bus tickets. So every morning, when a worker got on the bus, they would receive a ticket that said, "I wish you much strength today. With much respect, Mr. Piñera." And every night when they got on that bus exhausted, they got another ticket that said, "I hope you rest with your family. Thank you for helping build up this country. With much respect, Mr. Piñera." Unfortunately, absolutely none of my ideas were taken into consideration. The tile company made flower patterns, the dishware company painted nice, cute animals, the wine company copied some damn labels from Bordeaux. And the president actually hired the buses, but instead put his name in giant on the sides. I didn't understand what had gone wrong. How had I failed to explain my ideas? How could I possibly make a difference of any kind if those in power didn't seem interested in change? I continued to propose ideas, and I continued to be rejected again and again and again and again. As time went by and more dreaded birthdays passed and I grew older, one morning I was once again able to step outside my field of vision. This time I didn't step back. This time I stepped forward. And now for the first time I was able to see how others had seen me. They hadn't seen an authority figure. They had seen a young and experienced artist, a dreamer. And therefore, even though my ideas had been considered very creative, no one had really taken them seriously. That day I understood that it's not enough to see the solutions to the problems that others don't. You also need to be seen as the person who can solve the problem. For the first time, I felt blind. I couldn't see how I could possibly make a difference of any kind. I stopped asking for permission, for budgets, for funds. I focused on my own work as an artist. And I worked with all my heart. I worked blindly to make the things that I saw, hoping that someday others would see them. I turned street lines into dollar signs to remind us that corporations were taking over our cities and influencing our democratic system. I installed wheelchairs into park swings to remind the new generations that life swings both ways, and we would be the disabled ones if we would not take care of those with disabilities. Obsessed with time and statistics and death, I looked into the AIDS epidemic in Africa. And I wondered how the ban that the Christian church had held for decades on condoms could have influenced the spread of HIV. I searched for maps of AIDS and maps of religion, and I posted them both together on the street so experts could check for correlation. I looked into the eyes of our young US soldiers that come back from war. And I looked into statistics of suicide in the military. I found that in 2009, our soldiers had committed suicide at twice the rate than they had been killed by enemy fire. I was astonished. I posted it on Facebook. None of my 5,000 friends made a comment. So I bought a can of paint, and I posted it in the real world. And now this image was able to transmit what the statistic couldn't. The image went viral, ended up on CNN, and actually got people to write about it. I looked back at my country and remember that in 1973, Chile's national stadium had been turned into a concentration camp, where General Pinochet had gone into power and had people imprisoned, interrogated, tortured, and killed there. Our stadium had continued to be used as a sports center without any sort of cleansing. I worked for 3 years, and I rented the national stadium for myself for a full week. We brought in heavy machinery and dug up a hole in the middle of a soccer field and planted a tree right there, and then opened up the gates to the public. Now the space, decontextualized, turned into a memorial, would remind us to see the horrific acts that had happened and could never be repeated. To end in a cathartic and positive note, I used all my creativity to manage to convince Chile's national soccer team to play a match with the tree in the middle. We even had to throw a guy on top of the tree just to throw the ball down. 40,000 people went and filled up the stadium, and the crowds would roar and clap like crazy whenever they had seen the players play around the tree. A few years ago, I was called by a gallery to design their entry door. I looked at their door, and I told them they needed to add a second viewer. I said, "We've been closing an eye for centuries. It's about time we open the other one and look again." I asked them also to incorporate the viewers outwards looking in and to always leave the lights of the gallery on, so a passerby could always have the opportunity to look and see what he might have missed. 15 years after having graduated from school, the director of my university officially accepted my blank thesis into the library. And after all this time, what I've learned is that if you work really hard, if you work blindly, even those who might have missed you, even those who might have missed your ideas, will eventually gather around you to see what you're building. So, whichever way you decide to live your lives, whether it's cautiously and measured like my grandfather, or whether it's passionately and courageously like my uncle, step back, remember that life is short, and please, you owe it to yourselves to live your life with both eyes wide open. Thank you.